4.2 million people are already infected.
Over 600 people are dying daily from AIDS.
The largest HIV-positive population in the world.
The DAC would regularly put out figures in terms of how many people would die if drugs were not administered.
We always read in the media about HIV, and it was only associated with death.
People are dying like flies because of AIDS and because the HIV statistics are so unbelievable.
The prevalence rate in 1990 was 0.7% only. Until by 2005, it was 30.2%.
HIV is not terribly efficiently spread by sex. The sense of a hyperinfectious disease is the wrong one in the general public consciousness. There's some studies that suggest it's as low as 1 in 1,000 chances, which is sex every night for over 3 years.
If you don't use a condom, you will die.
Why do you think South Africa, out of all the countries in the world, has such a high infection rate?
One of the reasons might be that we started very late. Programs to combat HIV and AIDS. But look, it's difficult to say.
Now, there are various questions that arise, which have not been resolved.
When the government really turned round and decided to stab people with HIV in the back by denying the scale of the epidemic, by questioning the safety of antiretroviral medicines, by questioning our own bona fides as activists, we had to fight.
I think a good move in this country would to actually put all HIV-infected women onto permanent antiretroviral therapy.
The monitoring of antiretrovirals becomes absolutely critical.
Doctors are telling me HIV is the main cause of AIDS. We need action fast, and all we're getting is this ridiculous debate.
Thabo Mbeki belongs in jail.
We have to have an unequivocal message out there that HIV causes AIDS and the treatment of HIV is antiretroviral therapy.
The so-called HIV/AIDS theories have been postulated since 1983.
They have their version of the truth and they don't wish it to be challenged.
The politics are very intense. You speak out against the stuff and your career gets damaged.
Billions are being diverted into new buildings and new empires at universities.
Up to now, they have not had any answers whatsoever.
We all know the virus changes all the time.
For an HIV to be positive, you have to have at least 2 of the major bands.
In the village of Molepolole in Botswana, together with her family and dog, Picasso, lives Oni Meo Pute. When her son Richard was sick as a baby, the doctors recommended that she have an HIV test.
So this is for supper.
I was working as a maid, so I didn't afford to buy milk, and my employer wasn't even helping me with milk. I was earning 100 pula note. So I used to mix water and sugar for Richard. Starch water, that's what you call it. Suddenly Richard started getting diarrhea and vomiting until he got admitted at the hospital. So then the social welfare officer called me in to approach for an HIV test. I refused because my knowledge then was that AIDS was death, HIV was death. So when my boss was working, I was having this diarrhea. Then he just walked past. He said, Oni, if you could have an HIV test, you might live up to 80. Because if you know what is happening with your immune system, you'll do something about it. I didn't answer him, but I actually did go and get a test.
The AIDS epidemic was represented as spreading to southern Africa in the 1990s. By the turn of the millennium, there were grim predictions that the population would be decimated if urgent action wasn't taken. Heated debates regarding the implementation of ARV treatment were strongly influenced by the devastating epidemiological projections.
One day, she told me that she was HIV positive. There were a lot of resistance in the beginning, but because I was not marrying HIV, I was marrying the woman that I love. Then we went ahead with the wedding.
In terms of our treatment program, we've moved from 0 people on treatment.
We are now at 1.5 million.
These are people that would otherwise be dead.
No one who is living with AIDS should be denied access to life-changing medicine.
The overdrive of the CD4, they said was 201. The viral load, they said was 665,000. So I pushed to get them to put me on ARVs because they said it's urgent. I said, okay, let's get it done.
HIV is not a death sentence if you do the right thing.
But it is a big decision still when to go to antiretroviral treatment, because once you start, you can't stop.
When we started our ARV program, we used a particularly toxic drug called D4T or stavudine. And it's associated with a higher level than predicted of lactic acidosis. Lactic acidosis is an insidious condition that is caused by blockage of the mitochondria. Mitochondria are the powerhouses of the cells.
Mitochondria are those energy-producing organelles inside human cells, which are essential to healthy human metabolism. They are essential to life. You knock out mitochondria, you knock out the cell's ability to function.
So it blocks the normal use of oxygen.
And when you damage mitochondria permanently or impair their function, then the toxic ill effects are massive on across a broad range.
The way it presents is that patients lose weight, they become nauseous and tired, and a common adage we use in our clinic is beware the vomiting patient on antiretroviral therapy. If someone's vomiting on ARVs, we need to find out why. It can be something relatively simple like a pregnancy or a harbinger of a lactic acidosis. The way that we treat it is we stop the medicines.
A positive HIV test result is like living in a thick, dark forest which has many scary sounds. I entered this forest in 2001. My heart raced. My mind blew everything out of proportion.
Lawyer and former magistrate Anthony Brink, who heads an organization called the Treatment Information Group, has researched and reviewed the clinical literature on AZT and nevirapine, drugs used in the prevention of mother-to-child transmission program and ARV regimens for adults. An early draft of his book debating AZT led President Mbeki to order an inquiry into the drug in 1999, and this was followed by several other books and letters.
An enormous amount has been published about the toxicity of AZT, but I think it's all summed up in the label appearing on bottles of as little as 25 milligrams, supplied for research use by Sigma Aldrich Chemical Company. Now, 25 milligrams is 1/4 the amount in a single capsule supplied by GlaxoSmithKline. The label bears a skull and crossbones embossed on an orange stripe, which is industry hazard for deadly toxic chemical hazard. Toxic by inhalation, in contact with skin, and if swallowed. It just defies reason why anybody in their right mind would want to swallow a cell toxin as deadly as this, particularly one which targets blood, bone marrow, when it's said that they have too few defensive blood cells. This is, a prescription to wipe them out.
AZT has risk factors. It causes anemia. And a lot of HIV-infected patients, because of their concomitant infections, are already anemic.
After I did all the tests, the doctor told me I had bone marrow suppression. Then he said, I think I need to change your ARVs. You know, without fail, every night we'll be going to the hospital because I'll be like I'm dying. Edison was so tired, he was so fed up.
Nevirapine has two main forms of toxicities, well, two forms of toxicity. The one is liver toxicity. What we do to prevent and to find that out is we do liver functions before we start, and then we monitor them during the program. And the other one is skin.
Nevirapine is so acutely poisonous that it was banned by the Centers for Disease Control for administration to doctors and nurses accidentally pricked by hypodermic needles in clinics and hospitals because of reported death, complete liver failure requiring transplant, dying swathes of skin peeling off. It's called Stevens-Johnson syndrome, or TEN, toxic epidermal necrosis, death, skin death. So it's very, very poisonous indeed. It's banned even for short-term administration, and that is after just an average of 2 weeks. Death and complete liver failure, other severe ill effects.
They had, one would presume, a normal CD4 count because they were HIV non-infected, and it's immune-mediated, which is why we tend to steer away from it at very high CD4s. I have had cases of Stevens-Johnson in my own patients, and don't think I didn't take it lightly, but I knew that the risk of untreated HIV was going to kill the patient more likely than the risk of Stevens-Johnson.
You say that ARVs are the most effective treatment for HIV/AIDS.
Leanne, it's since the decision by the Cabinet in 2003 to provide antiretroviral therapy in a wide-scale rollout, we have been doing this across the country.
The antiretroviral drugs are among the most toxic substances ever approved for human use, and it's not ever been shown that adults or children or fetuses in the womb taking these drugs live longer or at least better lives than a similar group of people not taking the drugs.
Antiretroviral therapy reduces the death due to AIDS by 90%, the risk of opportunistic infections by over 90%.
There's simply no foundation for that statement. I mean, the AIDS experts love making these ex cathedra authoritative statements. But there's no foundation.
We are convinced that they are better than providing no treatment at all.
No drug manufacturer makes the claim that its ARV drug, alone or in combination with others, saves lives, reduces susceptibility to disease, or anything of the sort. On the contrary, they all make the point. And you can continue to suffer, or you can continue to contract, AIDS-indicated diseases and so on. So the manufacturers don't make the claim that the enthusiasts, lay enthusiasts and medical enthusiasts make for these drugs. Not a single ARV drug doesn't have a black box warning at the top of the package insert.
I think that what you have to bear in mind is that there is no risk option. If I know that I can increase your surrogate marker, your CD4 count, by giving you triple antiretroviral therapy, and that increases the mortality, decreases mortality, I can never withhold that from a patient.
The biggest, best conducted study yet conducted, reported in The Lancet, August 2006, found a discrepancy between the surrogate markers and clinical presentation. The better you did according to the blood tests, the worse you got clinically, and even reported a raised incident death rate among the people taking these drugs in the first year. Why would anybody in their right mind want to swallow a poison that's going to accelerate the death rate of people taking them?
Tell me one study, I don't care what the study was, a controlled clinical trial that showed that people taking the antiretroviral drugs live longer or better lives than a similar group of people not taking those drugs.
Okay.
I'll go better than a study. Okay?
Better than a study.
I'll
That's
go
all we
into
have
my
in science.
I'll go into my own family.
I am not prepared to accept anecdotal evidence, from myself or from Dr. Letape. I am interested as a medical scientist in proper research output and conclusions.
It's always the risk-benefit ratio that we weigh up. I'm afraid HIV is way worse than the medicine.
Proper studies, randomized control studies have been asked for, but none are coming.
The government was denounced for delaying the implementation of so-called life-saving ARVs, with many critics emphatic that there was no time for discussion when people were dying at such a sensational rate. The solution punted was antiretroviral treatment.
AIDS experts are reporting progress in many parts of Africa. Antiretroviral drug programs in countries like Rwanda, Botswana and South Africa have slowed the spread of the disease and now allow many people who are infected with it to live virtually normal lives. But South Africa still has more than 5 million HIV cases, the most in the world, and about 900 South Africans die of AIDS every day.
If we look at what has happened to the mortality rate of the 25 to 50-year-olds in this country, the number of people who died in that age group when HIV became a big problem rose. So instead of having the normal pie as people get older, more people die, suddenly we had a great group of people who were dying earlier. And only now has that trend in the mortality rate been reversed. It's actually the introduction of the ARV program.
An expert at Statistics South Africa, Dr. Suleiman Bar, analyzed the data and came to the conclusion that a significant portion of the increase in mortality could be accounted for by improvement in the number of deaths registered, which is known as the percentage of completion of death registration. This improvement was due to strategies implemented by the government to make death registration easier, especially in rural areas where most of the unregistered deaths occurred. Though the Medical Research Council and ACID did agree that improvements in death registration had increased the number of reported deaths to some degree, these organizations thought HIV was the main driver in the increase in mortality. Christopher Rawlins has analyzed the epidemiological data produced by the various organizations.
If you look at the Stats SA mortality figures, in 1996 they produced a total of 294,000. Now in that year, Dr. Suleiman Bar, who was recognized as the foremost demographer in South Africa at the time, concluded on the basis of his research that registration completion was only 37% in the rural areas of our country, as opposed to 86% in the urban areas. The rural areas comprised 46% of the country. So overall registration completion in 1996 was 63.5%. Now in 1997, Stats SA produced a mortality total of 318,000. And applying the population growth rate, it can be calculated that the registration completion had improved to 67%. Applying the 67% to the total of 318,000 in 1997 would give you a total of real actual deaths in that year of 475,000. If you then apply the population growth rates, if you apply those percentages to the 475,000, you would expect by 2001 a total mortality of around 520,000. In fact, for that year, Stats SA produced a total of 454,000, even less than the expected total. To arrive at the actual real total for 2001, you need to apply the estimated registration completion for that year. The latest Stats SA report for 2009 estimates that it was around 90%. But even if you take a completion level for the year 2001 of 85%, that would produce a real total of around 530,000. Just about the same, or fractionally more, than the predicted total. But it was by that year
There were shocking news reports of a staggering increase in the mortality rate from the mid-1990s, especially amongst the age group of 15 to 49, and particularly in women.
Dr. Richards has made very clear the explanation for this. In the apartheid years, because of the Bantustan policy, there was a over-concentration of women in the rural areas. The Stats SA mortality for the year 96-97 would show a much greater registration of male deaths amongst the younger age groups than female. The evidence is clear that females were far less registered.
Stats SA gave a provincial breakdown of the mortality rate for the period 1997 to 2002. Dr. Rodney Richards analysed the data. What he found was that there was a greater increase in the mortality rate in the provinces that had larger rural populations, which is where the biggest increase in death registration would be expected to occur, rather than the provinces with the highest prevalence rate.
If you then extend this comparison to the year 2006, which is when mortality peaks, according to Stats SA. If you again start with the total in 1997, apply the 67% registration completion, which brings it up to 475,000, then apply the population growth rates, you arrive at an expected total in the year 2006 of around 560,000. Now the 613,000 shown by Stats SA translates into a real total based on a registration completion of likely 95%. It would translate into a total of real deaths of about 645,000, which is about 100,000 greater than would be expected. But then there is this additional factor resulting from the large influx of immigrants since democracy, and especially since the year 2000 and the economic collapse in Zimbabwe, when an estimated minimum of 2 million Zimbabweans arrived in South Africa.
Chris Rawlins compared the data produced by the Human Sciences Research Council to that of the Actuarial Society of South Africa.
We have now got trend analysis in terms of the prevalence of HIV. 11% of the population 2 years and above is HIV positive.
The HSRC did fieldwork nationally by testing household samples for HIV prevalence, while ASA used the prevalence findings from antenatal sampling combined with Stats SA mortality figures to model the epidemic.
The Human Sciences Research Council showed child prevalence decreasing quite dramatically. In contrast, the Actuarial Society of South Africa show the prevalence increasing over this period. A diametrically opposite prediction. These figures are mathematically impossible. The mortality figures for children have historically been very low. Absurdity of the successive estimates of the HSRC is shown by this absence of any mortality, because it's mathematically impossible for a group to reduce from 710,000 to 340,000 5 years later. If you look at the age group 15 to 19, in 2002, the HSRC showed approximately 103,000 male and 186,000 female. The ASA model shows for male only 8,000 compared to female of 163,000. That is a difference of 20 times greater female. And this huge disparity continues in the later years. Each model has been successively found to be overstating the deaths. it's not just the ASA models which have failed, but as Rion Malan pointed out, the similar predictions from UNA and other bodies, all massively overstating the later observed mortality.
Experts were claiming, this is 1999, that there had been 250,000 deaths in that year alone, in South Africa alone. And so it struck me that if one could verify that that was true, it was obscene even to continue the debates, and that if I could prove that, which I thought was just a matter of a phone call or two, it would end the debate, and the denialists and President Mbeki would have to sort of retreat into the corner and wear dunce caps. So I went out and started looking for corpses, and that's many years ago, and I'm still looking today.
I've had several letters in the press. As early as 2004, I was highlighting the fact that there was this huge discrepancy between the so-called prevalence amongst children and the lack of any increase in mortality whatsoever in children. It was after I'd publicly highlighted it that ASA recalibrated their models, and HSRC produced a study showing child prevalence declining. Clearly both of these actions related to the observed evidence of a lack of any mortality amongst children.
In the late 1980s, Uganda was considered the epicenter of AIDS, but in the next decade, the prevalence dropped dramatically, despite minimal access to ARVs. While the Western media depicts Uganda as being ravaged by AIDS, in Joan Shenton's film, AIDS in Africa, Ugandan doctors present an entirely different view.
The interpretation of the picture of AIDS in Uganda, and this is unfortunately arising from our strategy of coming out and speaking openly about this disease, while some other countries have preferred not to publish the actual situation.
We have just recently undergone through a series of wars in this country, and this has led to a breakdown in our health services. It's not unknown that following wars or famines, increases do occur, particularly in infectious diseases or communicable diseases, of which TB is one of them.
Botswana, they started low, they skyrocketed, they peaked up there.
But there's no evidence at all that the Botswana population has been decimated 20 years later.
Neither Chris Rawlins nor Rodney Richards have had a response to their papers from the Medical Research Council, the HSRC or ASA. After several months of trying to gain an interview with an ASA epidemiologist, finally one agreed. So I sent her some questions, but she responded with suggestions for alternative questions. When I responded back that I would still like to ask her the original questions based on the research of Rawlins and Richards, she did not email me back. And to date, their work remains unrebutted.
He, by chance, came across the theories of the AIDS denialists, and he then fitted those theories into his own ideas that AIDS was being exaggerated in order to undermine Africa and to undermine the new South Africa, and that AIDS was a reflection of Western racism about black people.
We're all very familiar with the risk group for HIV.
An epidemic that has assumed the lines of apartheid. The Africans have a prevalence upwards of 15%.
These are absolutely staggering figures.
African people have cultural and social practices that create a network that enables the spread of the virus.
The only unfortunate thing is the perceptions that people have. Okay, this guy is married to an HIV positive girl, so he's also positive, and he's going to infect everyone who associates with him. I said, no. My wife, yes. The doctor, they say, is HIV positive. What does that mean?
From the late 1980s and early 1990s, HIV was depicted as spreading into the heterosexual population.
L'AIDS ci vede così. Non discrimina tra uomini e donne. Non ci giudica dal colore della pelle. Non riconosce differenze di religione.
Kevin de Kock acknowledged in June 2008 that there never was and there never will be a heterosexual AIDS epidemic, except in southern Africa, which for some reason is uniquely different from the rest of the world.
Every single South African, regardless of age, must test at least once a year.
What do the HIV tests measure?
They took the blood specimen from me, ran it through the lab, and I still tested negative. Then he was baffled. That's why he asked me if I have a girlfriend. Maybe I'm not having sex with my wife.
Dr. Uta Jensch is the CEO of Contract Laboratory Services, which does testing for clinical trials.
If we look at the general principle of an HIV rapid or ELISA, it's obviously a test that detects specific anti-HIV antibodies. And if you look at the type of antigens used in rapids or ELISAs, they generally encompass combinations of envelope and core protein. Basically, the envelope is the GP120 160 protein. Then there's also another protein that is commonly employed, that is the transmembrane protein, GP41. And then the core protein, that is the P24. The state-of-the-art tests these days would employ a combination of both envelope and core proteins. We use sequential testing with ELISAs or rapids. In other words, if you have a reactive result in your first ELISA, you would then confirm that result with a second different and possibly even a third ELISA.
If you're running two rapid HIVs, you get positive on the one and negative, so you get a discordant result. So we then use the Western blot to confirm. But some algorithms require a Western blot if your HIV is positive, or if we then do a secondary testing, which would be your ELISA. So you would use the Axum ELISA, or we also have a manual ELISA test. So we then do the ELISA, and then the final testing would be your Western blot. The patient's serum is incubated with the strips. After various stages of washing, adding conjugate, we then read the end result. Each strip is evaluated for the presence of bands. So for an HIV to be positive, you have to have at least two of the major bands, either GP160 plus a P24, GP160 plus GP41. In the absence of bands, such as here, that would be a patient that is negative.
Okay, so in this case, where we just have a GP120 envelope band, we would request another sample. And if there was an intercurrent infection like a flu or whatever, normally repeat testing, then that may be resolved. However, there are just some people who maintain indeterminate Western blots without being infected. But there are very specific risk groups that you do need to look out for, and where testing should actually be mandatory. Also in South Africa, all pregnant moms are tested for HIV because we can offer mother-to-child transmission. Many package inserts will quote, if we're talking about false positives, that multiparous women are at risk of producing a false positive result. In principle, that is true, but I also think that our tests are so sensitive and specific at this stage that it's really a rare event. I think if you're in the clinical situation where you're dealing with a pregnant mom who's had multiple pregnancies and you don't believe the lab result, you would obviously investigate further, possibly do supplementary testing to try and exclude a false positive.
Since a false positive looks like a true positive, how can you ever distinguish whether it's truly a positive or a negative?
Well, that's a great question. It's going to be very hard to determine a false positive.
Initially, the virus was demonstrated in culture as a virus, and with time, the different components of the virus were identified. And if you look at the virus under electron microscopy, you can very clearly see the protruding spikes on the top of the envelope. You can see the core. And as we moved forward in the years, we've just learned more about these antigens.
In the early 1980s, Luc Montagnier of the Pasteur Institute in France and Robert Gallo at the National Cancer Laboratory in the US led experiments in which HIV was allegedly isolated for the first time and its proteins determined.
Its discovery was reported in May 1983 in Science, American Scientific Journal. In 2008, Professor Luc Montagnier and François Bar-Senoussi were co-Nobel Prize winners for their discovery of HIVs.
We started by chance with the retrovirus hypothesis, and it was the right one.
That was really the exciting moment to think, okay, we have a new virus, for sure.
Some luck, in science. Sometimes, not always.
If you look at any test, antibody test kit, manual, package insert, what have you, you generally find his paper as number one supporting the statement that the test is testing for HIV. It all goes back to Montagnier, so it's not possible to exaggerate the critical importance of this paper. But when we have a hard look at the paper, we discovered that his science is completely worthless. It was complete junk.
Eleni Papadopoulos-Iliopoulos and colleagues, collectively known as the Perth Group, have written many papers critiquing the science that underpins the theory that HIV has been isolated and that it causes AIDS. Brink presented their research at a conference in Russia in 2008, and Papadopoulos-Iliopoulos explains her critique of the primary experiments in Brent Lung's film The Emperor's New Virus. Thus far, these critiques remain unrebutted.
Eleni Papadopoulos-Iliopoulos criticized Montagnier's method immediately and twice sought to publish in Nature, the world's other biggest scientific journal, and we got 2 rejections. It was published in different form later. It transpires that Montagnier did not do the science necessary to support his claim. Now, a retrovirus is said to be around 100 nanometers in diameter. So that translates to 100,000 of them side by side, spanning 1 millimeter. Tiny. Because it's impossible, practically, to work with one or a few of these particles, these retroviruses, it is necessary to purify them. Now what this means is, it's necessary to mass them together, separate them out from where they've come. You take the cell culture and you spin it in a centrifuge, not at very high speed, not for very long, but it has the effect of separating out the cellular constituents of your cell culture from the suspected viruses in it. And you drop it onto the top of a tube of specially prepared sucrose solution. The retroviruses are believed to have density of 1.16 grams per milliliter. After spinning the tube for many, many hours at very high speeds, the retroviruses are forced down the tube, down the sugar, into density gradient. Most importantly of all, without which nothing, it's necessary to publish an electron micrograph, that's a shot through an electron microscope, of what is banded in that density gradient. And incredibly, Montagnier never published an electron micrograph of the density gradient. The single picture he published was from the culture. He was asked in 1997 by the French-Algerian investigative journalist Jamel Tahi why he never published an electron micrograph of the density gradient, where one would have expected zillions of identical looking spherical particles. And he confessed on camera that despite a Roman effort, quote unquote, on examining the density gradient, they could find no particles with the morphology of retroviruses. It's quite incredible. In his paper, we see some blobs next to a cell wall which were claimed to be HIV, then called LAV. And they were described as type C particles. Amazingly,
Professor Montagnier's photograph of his C-type particles, which he claimed to be HIV, is that C-type particles are common in uninfected persons. They are abundant in the majority of normal human placentas.
Montagnier had no control cultures, and he used umbilical cord cells to culture with presumed to be infected cells. Thus, the type C particles could have come from the umbilical cord cells.
There's no unanimity about what these particles are. They are described differently by different scientists. Some say they are type C particles, some say type D, some say lentiviruses, all with quite different morphology. The proteins found in the density gradient were assumed to be retroviral because that's where retroviruses are all banned.
The prime is used in the genetic tests for babies and the viral load tests used as a marker of the quantity of virus in patients are also derived from the genetic material banding in the density gradient.
Unless an electron micrograph has been published of the band showing nothing but, or almost nothing but, retroviruses with a characteristic morphology, orbital, lateral bodies, conical core, suckers, blebs, suckers all around. Unless this is found in the density gradient, then how do you know what you've got? Because, again, all molecular biologists can see that it's not only retroviruses that will band there, other stuff can band there too, so you have to have a look. Now, in 1997, two research teams went looking at what bands at the 1.16 grams per milliliter density gradient.
In the same issue of Virology in 1997, the first paper was by a German-French collaborating team led by Pablo Glushenkov.
Amazingly, because no one took any notice, what they published was just a mess of cellular debris, not a concentration of identical-looking particles with the expected morphology. They were way too big, way in excess of the known diameter of retroviruses, around 100 nanometers. We're speaking of like 260. The American team, Julian Bess, looked at the proteins contained in the density gradient, which they imagined contain HIV, and compared it with a control of from a non-infected culture originally.
He performed an analysis of the protein content of his purifications, believed to be infected and believed to be uninfected. The proteins believed to be retroviral are also found in the purification of believed uninfected purifications.
How is it possible then that the control culture has the same proteins, just different quantities? It makes no sense at all.
Here we see Bess's purification. He finds an overwhelming contamination of cellular debris, cellular fragments called microvesicles, mixed in with which are objects that he claims to be V for virus.
Antibody tests, which are derived from, and it's back to the root problem, antibody tests which are built with or constructed with the proteins derived in the band thought to contain the retrovirus. But when examined by Bess and Gluckenschopf in 1997, found to contain no retroviruses as expected, and those few particles among all the cellular constituents, those few particles identified as HIV were too big, had the wrong shape, wrong look. So what a mess. It's a gargantuan error. You see, what the test is really doing is it's just picking up a condition called, well known to medicine, called hypergammaglobulinemia, meaning the person who registers as HIV positive has got more antibodies swirling around in his bloodstream. It's not necessarily the case, but generally speaking, it's not good to have a heightened level of antibodies in your bloodstream. It frequently, or it can, signify some or other health stress. But it's certainly absolutely wrong to contend that to be HIV positive predicts that you will fall ill and die. So there's something very, very wrong. And this should have been the end of the story. But these papers attracted hardly any attention and hardly any comment. Of course, they weren't missed by Papadopoulos Iliopoulos and her group in Perth, Australia, who underscored the crucial significance of these two papers and this latter experiment for the HIV theory of AIDS.
We cannot say that you have a new retrovirus unless you show that it has unique proteins and unique RNA. And to show that, you must purify the virus. There is no other way.
Becoming aware that many scientists and doctors disputed the evidence that HIV had been isolated and that it was the cause of AIDS prompted former President Thabo Mbeki to put together an international advisory panel of people from both sides of the debate. The panel convened in 2000, in the months leading up to the hosting of an international AIDS conference in Durban.
At the second meeting of then President Thabo Mbeki's International AIDS Advisory Panel, I sat and watched as Papadopoulos Iliopoulos proposed the performance of experiments to try and purify and isolate this virus. The most important thing to come out of the conference was the agreement to perform this experiment to prove the existence of HIV, if it can be proven. In the room were Helene Gale from the US Centers for Disease Control, representatives from the National Institute of Communicable Diseases. So this was, formally agreed, formally minuted, and it's in the AIDS panel report. There's no question. This was agreed to be done.
One of the decisions they've taken, the international panel, orthodox and dissident everybody, they took a decision that it was necessary to answer the question, What do the HIV tests measure?
As it turned out, it was never performed.
I requested interviews with senior experts at the National Institute of Communicable Diseases about the issue of isolation. Ultimately, they declined to be interviewed for the film, though it was confirmed that the isolation experiments had not been redone. Instead, only some standardization of tests had been conducted, a waste of time in their opinion. Standardization involves comparing one test to another, which does not clarify whether the proteins and the genetic material used in HIV tests are specific to a unique retrovirus, HIV.
You see, in any other scientific discipline, the failure of a hypothesis to be validated by later evidence, by later data, would mean a complete re-examination of the hypothesis.
The people who hold the view that HIV causes AIDS dislike him. They dislike him for asking questions because they have something at stake. And Mbeki questions this. So if you dismiss the question of HIV causes AIDS, drug companies will lose out.
Any challenge to the HIV/AIDS hypothesis is answered with tremendous animosity or derision. And in fact, you repeatedly hear AIDS experts, so-called, and their popular promoters in NGOs and the like, boastfully proclaiming that we do not debate with and will have nothing to do with AIDS denialists. And by using the supercharged expression denialists, they delegitimize the challenge, and they give it a morally opprobrious quality, as if the facts are, the knowledge is abundantly established and may not be challenged. It's like a religious dogma. Now that's the thing. A religious dogma cannot be challenged. It's a matter of faith. It's not open to being impeached on rational grounds, on the grounds of the missing evidence, etc. But a scientific theory is supposed to welcome, like I say, supposed to welcome criticism. The Democratic Alliance released a public health warning listing me as the most dangerous person in the country, ahead even of then President Thabo Mbeki, saying the following: President Thabo Mbeki, Anthony Brink, deny the existence of the human immunodeficiency virus itself. The DA's objective in compiling this list is to make it clear why these individuals are so dangerous and raise public awareness about who they are and what they stand for. These individuals hide behind the excuse of promoting scientific debate in order to promote views that are false and dangerous. The DA calls on the media, the public, and interestingly, professional organizations to exclude these individuals from positions of authority, deny their dissident views publicity, and take vigorous steps to pursue official action in respect of any infringements of the law. I mean, this is an echo of the Suppression of Communism Act, the Internal Security Act that succeeded it, in terms of which legislation anybody the government didn't like could simply name a communist. And if you were named a communist, whether you espoused, whether you were in fact a communist or not, you could be a Catholic priest, but if you were named a communist, then you lost your civil liberties. Asking questions about the HIV/AIDS hypothesis is politically offside. That wherever I went, whether it was a social gathering or a book launch or a colloquium, what have you, whenever I mentioned my surname, people reacted very badly. And I took then to never using my surname when introducing myself, just my first name.
I looked at my profiling go down, 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 and the CD4 and viral load just making the doctor smile all the time.
Ani developed polyneuritis, a condition that damages the nerves in the spine due to taking ARVs.
For 2002, 3, 4, 5, 6, 2007, finally a doctor says, this is polyneuropathy. You look so okay. And when you tell people, I can't even sleep, I am in pain, they just look at you like this woman is just showing off. But it is a reality. The ARVs cause a lot of pain. You try to walk like you are walking on glass. There's a time, when I was cooking, I take these big pillows, these continental pillows. I put the continental pillow, then I stand on the pillow to cook at the stove. Now, I took that packaging set. I've highlighted. Truvada will make neuropathy. It will worsen it. Now I'm on drug number 4. It has been changed up to 4 times. Then the doctor said, all the ARVs, there's not one that you are going to find that doesn't have side effects. So this is just one you have to live with.
On the 26th of November 2004, I placed a full-page advertisement in the Mail and Guardian in collaboration with a natural health promoter. Why should South Africans continue to be poisoned by AZT? Hundreds of studies have found that AZT is profoundly toxic to all cells of the human body. Numerous studies have found that children exposed to AZT in the womb suffer brain damage, neurological disorders, paralysis, spasticity, mental retardation, epilepsy, other serious diseases, and early death. I could have added blindness too. Now, this is again an uncontroversial statement. The research data is out there. It's just a matter of looking at it. The publication of these statements caused a tremendous outcry. First of all, the editor apologized for publishing them and promised never to do so again. When I phoned her, she said no. Our newspaper's been at the forefront of the drive or the push for ARVs in this country. And continuing to publish statements like these would continue to damage our brand. It's like I've got a brand tie-up. It's incredible. The TAC and some other clown complained about these statements to the Advertising Standards Authority, and notwithstanding the submission of 2 lever arch files by me on the toxicity of AZT in support of these 2 statements, the Advertising Standards Authority said, no, we don't want all that stuff. We just want one guy to say the drug is bad, as you say it is. So I said, fine, here's Mhlongo. He confirms all this, Professor Mhlongo. He said, no, we don't want him because he's in some way associated himself with, with the dissident cause, and so he's not independent. And in the end, ruled against these statements, finding them unsupported, and banned them. The result is that it is not possible for me to reproduce these matter-of-fact statements about AZT, particularly in pregnancy, in a commercial newspaper in our country. I think the Mail and Guardian carries a very heavy responsibility for the generation of the liberal left consensus in our country in favor of AZT and nevirapine, because they've been avowed advocates of these drugs, and at the level of formal, declared editorial policy. And this explains why everybody thinks these drugs save lives, as opposed to the facts. No one knows the facts, which are the drugs are very, very toxic and are very, very harmful, and particularly to babies.
The professor told me, even if you can go to America or South Korea, where I come from, or anywhere, this condition that you have and HIV, there's nothing that can be done. Then I answered him, you are doing only up to this far. There is something that can be done. I'm on drugs. All the time I was on them. I stopped for 3 days. I feel better. Then I go on again. I get worse. Then I make it 1 week. I'm off for 1 week. Ooh, I'm even feeling better. I'm on again. 3 days down the line, I'm going down. Then I'm off for 2 weeks. When I was off a month, then I went on 5 days, I was back to where I was before. Then nobody can tell me it was not the drugs.
He's dehydrated, he's lost a lot of weight, and I'm sure if you took a test there, he will be HIV positive. This is South Africa. That is poverty.
You see, this kid is highly malnourished. You can see this source there. You can see the hair is sign of malnutrition. If you look at his tummy, you see, it's all sign of malnutrition. And with kwashiorkor babies, the baby can't even feed. The babies who are malnourished, who are having kwashiorkor, they don't have interest to eat. You know, and it's a problem. See, this kid has got good food, I mean, because he's in the hospital, but he can't eat the food simply because of the conditions he's having. This is the representative of the common case in the hospital. If you stay for a long time, you'll see a lot of these kids who are suffering malnutrition. The problem is that when these kind of kids get any kind of infection, because they are malnourished, they can't fight it. You see, I mean, AIDS is just one of those.
There are answers to poverty, but there are no answers to this so-called HIV/AIDS.
Your junior medical student will be taught that one of the things that will result in immune deficiency is bad nutrition. So you've got to attend to the matter of the nutrition of the people. You've got to attend to the matter of clean water. You've got to attend to the matter of the treatment of diseases described as opportunistic.
A study produced by the Children's Institute at the University of Cape Town, which showed the enormity of the poverty-related diseases, the continuation of these diseases from the apartheid era.
There is a condition called nutritional AIDS, which affects largely the bulk of the population in South Africa. There's no question about that. You just have to ask questions. Who lives in informal settlements? Who lives in run-down places? Who has no water? The figures speak for themselves. No question about that.
They're expecting me to come and get a CD4. They want to do CD4 and viral load. I'm very reluctant, but ever since I stopped ARVs, I didn't do any blood work. I've been refusing with my blood in case, so.
With the very sudden collapse of apartheid, disconcertingly, a new ideology was needed to take the place of apartheid ideology. And HIV/AIDS seemed to have stepped into the breach. And there's a tremendous moral enthusiasm around HIV/AIDS. And one of the reasons for this moral enthusiasm, especially among whites and white liberal types, is because it keys into your classic white liberal paternalism in this country, where Africans must be helped, and in the modern era, helped against themselves. And what Professor Jerry Kovadia calls their unbridled sexuality, openly talks this way. It's a profoundly racist conception of a people.
I still didn't get the CD4 done. I still didn't get the viral load done. As long as you are tying a CD4 to HIV, it doesn't mean anything, because for the past 8 years, I did them so well, on time, and they never said anything. They never meant anything. If the blood work is not good, like the full blood count, it tells me something. It reminds me of something. The whisper is there. The viral load, it doesn't say anything. All it says, it just opens the door. Take ARV. And I know right now my, my door in the system, if they do the tests, my door is open. They'll be putting me on the ARV.
We have spent a lot of money on this HIV thing, or the HIV has made us spend so much money that we could have put to good use.
The HIV theory of AIDS is the basic business model of the pharmaceutical industry's interest in ARV drugs.
The ancient Romans said it best, cui bono, who benefits? President Bush's $15 billion PEPFAR program is a simple money laundering scheme to transfer the wealth of American taxpayers into the bank accounts of the pharmaceutical cartel. Treatment Action Campaign and other brown shirt organizations play a necessary role in this grand extortion by setting the limits on permissible discourse. It's their job to make the expensive antiretroviral drugs look like an essential good that is being denied poor people.
It was over 4 years. I wasn't even lifting a finger. So to be doing this, you know, it's fulfillment of healing. I make food, I eat it. I also make valuable points of health. You can't get them anywhere else. You can't act it. I'm going to get some vegetables to put on my blender. This is rape. I mix it with spinach. Then I make a green smoothie. And it's fresh. No chemicals, you know?
Recently, an American kid, young gay man, on antiretrovirals, HIV positive obviously, with a viral load that's undetectable, which means pretty much he cannot infect anybody else. Went and had sex with somebody during a one-night stand where he didn't disclose HIV status, and used a condom. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison.
Now, I'm sure there'll be further discussion of the tremendous infringement of basic human rights that follows this maniacal, fallacious belief in HIV.
And I've been through that road. I'm living with some damages from the ARV. They're going to change over time. As and when we stop adding the ARVs, soon the blood will be clean and it will be okay. The truth is, HIV is a body that needs proper feeding. It's a body that needs life. It's a body that has whispered. Dawn came, and what seemed to be my worst nightmare turned out to be little twigs with beautiful dark green leaves moving because of the beautiful fresh breeze that blows in the forest.
No way am I going to die. I have plans glistening in my eyes. I have given up my ARVs, my passport to death and disease. What do you believe? The truth or all the propaganda? They have brought nothing but profit at the loss of many lives. Empty promises and what you read. I can live, but they are driven by greed. Take the pills and you might die. Find the facts, recheck their lies. Take the facts. What do you believe? The truth or all the propaganda? They have brought nothing but profit at the loss of many lives. Speak against the mainstream. Stand your ground, wake up from this dream. Your health and life in drugs not found. The sun is setting on their shroud. Take the facts. What you believe? The truth or all the propaganda? They have brought nothing but profit at the loss of men.